We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares.
Welcome to Changing Our World. I'm Linda Weltner. I'm here for the third time with the only person we've ever had on the show, more than once, I think.
Uh-oh.
And we're on the third time because Christopher Swain is sort of the icon of an environmental educator, which means that he's out in the environment in ways that you wouldn't believe. He has swum the Columbia River, the Hudson River, the Charles River, the Mystic River, and he is 400 miles along on so it's been 4 years, right?
That he has been
swimming from the Canadian border all the way to Washington. And so let me just start with the basic question, Christopher, before we get into what you're doing with this. What gave you this idea to go swim rivers?
It happened accidentally. If the
everything
truth
happens,
be
isn't
told,
it?
I would
Yeah.
never have guessed. I was definitely one of those kids in high school that the guidance counselor was taking aside and saying, you really need to pick something that you're good at so we can package you and get you into a college. And I remember thinking, there's not just one thing that I'm burning up to do. And it wasn't probably until I was over 30 that I had a sense that I wanted to do stuff for the environment and human rights, but even then I didn't know. So the accident, such as it was in 1995. I was doing a walk for human rights across the state of Massachusetts, which is sort of funny because it was the hottest summer on record. I remember when I saw Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth, they listed the 10 hottest summers on record, and of course 1995 has to be one. So I had a flaming torch. It was one of the prototype torches from the '84 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. And I was walking across the state of Massachusetts handing out copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, of course, what every 20-something envisions themselves doing in the summer. And this was fine, except that it was so hot, and it had these flaming flames, right, that I was overheating. So I remember joking to myself that, this was a bad plan, that if I do anything like this again in the summer, it should be a water thing. I should have been doing a swimming project. So then it started as a joke, but then somehow over the winter, I started doing master swimming. I was living in Gloucester at the time, the Gloucester YMCA. They'll teach you the strokes, give you some coaching. And then I thought, I really should swim next summer. I'll do a swim for human rights down the Connecticut River. And so I blocked out the lower 200 miles of the Connecticut River. I'll swim those, and I'll give out copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Someone in a boat with you?
A little inflatable boat with a little electric trolling motor, which the car battery, would die that we were driving it with. We even went through the remnants of some hurricane with my sister, Amanda. And what I realized during that swim was three things that I didn't expect to realize. One was, it was a terrible way to give out paper documents.
Yeah.
Second thing I realized was that the media found it intriguing that I was
got a lot of
swimming.
media attention.
And then that sort of made it okay because I could still get the human rights soundbite out there. Right? And give the 800 number of the UN Publications Office where they'd send you a free copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's okay that I had this soggy bag of stuff that I couldn't give out. Third thing I realized was that as interested as folks might have been in the human rights thing, what they really wanted to talk about was what's in the water you're swimming in. And especially when I was swimming through Springfield, Massachusetts and Hartford, Connecticut, the water was really dirty and compared to even how it is now, right? Because we're talking about 1996. And especially with a lot of the sewage and the combined outflows, from the storm drains and stuff that were mixing with sewage in the cities. And I was getting ear infections and all these kind of things. So what people really wanted to say is, do you know that you're swimming in poop? Do you know that you're swimming in these gas and oil slicks? What are you doing? So I filed away this little thing that if you swim, one of the things people are going to want to talk about, secretly wish that they could talk about more, is all the goop in the water.
Yeah.
But nothing came of that right away. I finished acupuncture school. That's where I did my master's. I worked in Boston for a while, and then we moved to Oregon. And it was in Oregon that I accidentally fell in love with the Columbia River, started looking for ways to help her, and long story short, in 2000, which I guess is 4 years later, as I was standing in a rainstorm next to the banks of the Columbia River, somewhere near Arlington, Oregon, wondering what I was going to do, it flashed in my mind the idea of swimming, and then I had something of a sense memory of what it was like to be swimming in the Connecticut. Like I had that feeling again. And I thought, oh my God, this is an insane, crazy idea. Like it's one thing to swim, take some summer weekends and swim 200 miles down, the bottom half of the Connecticut. And now we're talking about, 1,243 mile long river that starts way up in Canada and, snakes all the way down through some of the really toughest conditions you could find on a river. It's a river no one's ever swum for perfectly good reason, because it'd be dangerous in all these different ways. The end of the river where it comes out into the Pacific Ocean between Washington and Oregon, the bar that's been created because of all the sediment that's gone out there over the years is called the Graveyard of the Pacific, because hundreds of boats and thousands of people have gone down right there. So there were a million reasons not to do it, but somehow I ended up realizing that would be the way to get the word out about the river.
Attention, yeah.
And it turned out to be a fabulous public education platform. Most of the jokes at the beginning were how I was going to die up north, or get sick and die.
Yeah, people were worried about you getting poisoned.
Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure the reason you end up on NPR is that they think, oh, this idiot's swimming through water filled with gas, oil, old telephone poles, nuclear waste, pesticides, arsenic.
We better get him on
dead
the show
meat.
before
Let's get
he
him
dies.
on the show.
Yeah.
Let's get this left wing nut on the show right now before he's dead. It worked really well there. And then the part that still pushes forward from that is getting so many emails from teachers saying, well, hey, I'm teaching science, or I'm teaching cultural studies, or I'm teaching this, and the Columbia River's part of what we're doing with that because of the region, right? And because of, in many cases, the Lewis and Clark unit. Because imagine in Oregon, where you and I would have done in elementary school the Revolutionary War unit, they're doing the Lewis and Clark unit. So they don't know a thing about the Revolutionary War, right? And we don't know a thing about Lewis and Clark here in third grade, but that's what you're doing. So that means you're going to end up on the Columbia. So suddenly all these schools were like, will you come talk to the kids about your experience and show your pictures? And then it sort of flashed like, wow, so suddenly you can be an adult and talk to kids, and instead of getting the occasional vibe that, oh, it's another adult standing up here talking to me, I can't stand it. I was getting the sense like, wow, this is a cool adult. He's risking his life. He's got interesting adventure stories. I got a glimpse that there might be a way in, through the armor of youth, right? Where you could actually embed a message about, here's what's going wrong for the river and for the environment, into an adventure story, and somehow that package could make it in and make an impression.
Did your trip down the river result in any changes in governments along the way?
Definitely. It definitely changed the tenor of the discussions people were having. I would say, if you're looking for specific examples, there's some fun specific examples that we can use. I went through, starting up north, very quickly, when I was coming through the Columbia wetlands, I swam through raw sewage that was coming from some of these very small towns in rural British Columbia. And I was able to bring that up publicly.
And then did they change it?
Well, they started the process of changing it. I don't know, it takes forever, right? But it begins. But what I noticed right away was, the first thing I got was, well, listen, you're not Canadian, you don't live here in this town, you should shut your mouth. And then I realized suddenly that I could say, that's true, but I am a North American and I did just swim through your poop. So actually, I do feel like I have a stake in it. And I'm not out to make trouble with you.
And I'm not an expert from some university who's just coming to tell you what to do.
Right, and I did talk to all your kids in the elementary school, and they all seem to think that it's okay if the river's clean. So that stuff started to shift right away. And once people saw I wasn't out to make trouble or grind an axe, then it advanced the debate. Another thing we did up in the wetlands was this whole thing of how much boat traffic should there be in the Columbia wetlands, because it's basically a
breeding ground.
Yeah, and it's also the biggest contiguous set of intact wetlands that's left on the North American continent. So it's this cradle of life you couldn't find anywhere else. Yeah. So you would want to tread lightly. So I was able to talk from a new place, not like, I have a jet boat and I get to do what I want, or, no one who doesn't have a canoe is allowed in here. I wasn't on either of those sides. I was able to say, hey, I'm a swimmer, and I can appreciate the water, but I can also appreciate what we all have here. And there were moments when I could actually get the hook and bullet folks and the powerboat folks to realize that the people they had the most in common with were the bird watchers and the canoeists and the kayaks, because they all shared this burning desire to get out into this incredible space.
First, you're swimming, which you ended up at the UN, right? At one point?
Oh, yeah.
This river swim, this guy has been at the UN and honored by them. The second part is as an educator. So you are using these swims now as a way to teach. Say you've come to a school on the Merrimack River. What would happen in the classroom?
Okay, so if you are in school in the Merrimack Valley, at some point in your education, at some point before 12th grade, you're going to end up doing a unit that has a lot to do with the Merrimack. And that's largely because a lot of history took place there, right? But for instance, in Lawrence and Lowell, the whole thing with the Industrial Revolution and the textile industry, and then all the labor things that went with that. My part of that would be, because people say, well, what the heck does that have to do with the ocean swim that you're on now? And I could say, well, okay, when you're swimming in Massachusetts Bay, and you want to teach about why Massachusetts Bay is such a rich mixing zone, and why it's an incredible feeding zone, and why there's so much diversity. In other words, why do we have right whales feeding in Massachusetts Bay? We have them there because there's so much fresh water coming into Massachusetts Bay that it creates an incredible amount of life because of what happens in the water there. Where does all that fresh water come from? Well, 80% of the fresh water that pours into Massachusetts Bay comes from the Merrimack River. And where's that water coming from? Well, to oversimplify, it's coming from the White Mountains. So when the White Mountains melt, when the snow melts there, that's coming down the Merrimack drainage, and all those nutrients are pouring out into Massachusetts Bay and making it that super rich habitat that it is now. So I'm able to say that there's no way to understand the ocean here in Massachusetts Bay without understanding the Merrimack, and then that's a way into anything you want to teach about the Merrimack, whether that's history, whether that's cultural studies, whether that's the biology and the chemistry.
Now, I learned at one point that there aren't 7 oceans, there's just one ocean.
Right.
It's all one, the water, traveling through the clouds and all.
Yeah, so if you're skiing and snowboarding, up north this winter, you're gonna boat and swim through some of that water and sail through some of that water this summer. And that's a big shift for people. And I remember in Oregon, it was the same thing. We talked to kids in the communities around Mount Hood and say, this is where it starts. What's melting off this glacier in the summer is going to end up in the Columbia and end up in the Willamette and end up in the Pacific. So you snowboarders who surf in the summer down on the shore, it's the same issue. It's the same clean water thing.
So these kids understand now that if they throw something trash into the Merrimack, they're affecting the whole world.
You'll see it again in Newburyport.
But I mean really over a long period of time. I have a little book about somebody who set loose a canoe. Have you ever seen that book?
Oh yeah.
And it tracks all his...
What was that one? It was a Great Lakes one, right?
Right. He goes through the little
Paddle
canoe.
to the Sea.
Paddle to the Sea. Is that
wonderful? I love
wonderful?
that book, yeah.
Yeah, I have that at home. on these school presentations.
And continue.
And then beach cleanups, which also bring in kids. And you're having 2 a year, is it?
Well, Marblehead, yeah, we do one in May right before the bathing season opens, right? So it's
Yes.
around Memorial Day. And then we do one after Labor Day sometime in September, usually second or third weekend in September when the bathing season closes.
And this is kind of a raising awareness.
It's an awareness raising thing because, as anybody knows, I mean, every time you go through a full tide cycle, there's probably more trash you could find. But I like to think of it this way, that if you were just obsessed with did we get it all clean, there's a moment twice a year in Marblehead when every single beach is clean.
And how much stuff do you take off?
Several hundred pounds every year. And it's the whole range from the plastic bottles and plastic bags that you and I say, oh, here we go again, to the more bizarre things like rolls of indoor-outdoor carpeting. Never clear, really, how they got there. You know, things like that.
But this is the message. If you're in a boat and you throw something over the side, it does not disappear.
Right, it doesn't.
It shows up on a beach somewhere, or it strangles a bird, or if it's a six-pack thing.
And your Dunkin' Donuts cup that you drop and the wind takes, it's going to end up in the water.
Right.
And it's going to float.
And last.
It's going to last a long time.
Yeah.
The ocean's going to run on Dunkin' for a long time.
And then the most recent thing you've started is this electronic recycling.
Right.
So just tell me what that is.
We were looking for a way to teach kids about not just the pollution you can see, you know, the Dunkin' Donuts cup and the plastic bottles that we can do at a beach cleanup, but to talk about the toxic chemicals and the heavy metals that are in the ocean that you can't see. So because kids can't think abstractly in kindergarten, you know, if I go waltzing into a kindergarten class talking about how there's brominated fire retardants in the ocean, I can't send those kids on a field trip down to Devereaux and say, hey, check out the brominated fire retardants. But I can say, how many of you have a computer or a TV or a cell phone at home? And of course, we all do, right?
Yeah.
And I say, hey, do you know if you take Dad's TV or Mom's cell phone or her laptop, you throw that into a dump somewhere, it breaks open and it rains, and you know, earlier in the presentation they've learned that as soon as, you know, the rain falls on the trash, right, it's gonna, what's inside is gonna begin to wash out and into the local creeks and rivers and streams, and that's gonna end up in the nearest big lake, or in our case, in a coastal community, in the ocean. So then suddenly you're gonna have the powders that are inside your computer designed to keep it from bursting into flame if it got too hot and started to smolder, are now in the ocean. And fish are going to swim in that water.
And if this gets sent to, say, Mali or some
or
country,
China,
or
right?
China, and they burn it, then it rises in the soot and falls in the ocean.
Falls as precipitation in the ocean.
Falls in the earth too, on the land.
So everything that you throw on the ground, potentially some of it's going to end up in the water eventually, because we're on a water planet,
And
right?
our electronics are particularly filled with dangerous toxins.
They're particularly dense amounts of it. Like, for instance, the brominated fire retardants, that's just a powder that's inside a lot of these devices. Well, that's showing up in toxic amounts in the blubber of whales and dolphins.
And in bloodstreams of people,
In
too.
bloodstreams of people, too. And if you look at the resident pods of killer whales, of orcas, say, on the West Coast, because that's the nearest place to study them, like, say, in Puget Sound near Seattle. So those are accessible whales that we can study over a period of time that don't leave and migrate.
Yeah.
If you look at those resident pods, when those animals die, because of course everything gets old and dies eventually, right? If you look in their blubber, they have huge amounts of mercury, PCBs, brominated fire retardants, all these arsenic.
But you know, you don't have to go that far, because there's a guy, a Unitarian minister in Salem. He had his blood tested, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like 153 different chemicals in his blood that didn't belong there.
Right.
Many of them really harmful.
I know. And then we talk about stuff like, you know, the sharks, and everyone's like, oh, the sharks, you know, but you can end up feeling bad about the sharks because they're eating seals that are eating fish that are swimming in contaminated water. And now you've got sharks that, you know, from time to time are dying just because the level of toxics is too great. And now a lot of the whales that end up on beaches, that's technically a hazmat site, because their blubber is so polluted and has such high levels of dangerous chemicals that it has to be cordoned
And
off.
it's not just them. That's the thing, not to go, oh, poor whales,
Right.
poor sharks. It's
Well, they're bigger
what's
predators,
happening
right.
to them is happening to us.
Right, because we're big mammals too. We're at the top of the
Right.
food
And,
chain
and
too.
it's affecting the number of children who are being born with all kinds of neurological damage because they are subjected to that chemical assault in the
Right.
womb of, and as the older you have your babies, the more you've collected.
Right, and you're fat and everything else.
Yeah, so it's really beginning to show up in our lives now.
And I think to some extent that's really the truly important point, the one you're making, which is
So-
that the oceans, or however you want to say it, have this ocean planet, if it reflects nothing else, it reflects the choices we've made, right? And the way we live our lives. I mean, the reason the Columbia River or the Atlantic Ocean or Massachusetts Bay is polluted is because of me. And because of you, and because of all of the things that we've created, bought, used, you know?
Although I'd like to say that even though a woman might decide to stop using, say, plastic diapers,
Right.
there's a factory producing them, and that we haven't chosen to have poisons in our shampoos and stuff like that. I hate blaming the consumer,
Right.
even though we are guilty, but it's the producers who are not kept from no control over which chemicals they use, and that's really where the problem stems from, because they're creating these things. We're only using them, and most of us in total ignorance of the harm we're doing.
Yeah, and I think this is an argument, but I don't know, this is a cultural problem more than anything than a scientific problem. That's the argument for the bringing the precautionary principle sort of forward into
the
the
government.
statutes and into the legislative process. And for those people who don't know, that's the idea that unless you can determine clearly, you can establish that some, let's say, chemical that you want to use in a product doesn't harm life, then you can't use it until you've established that it doesn't.
Right, and we have, until 500,000 people have died from this, we can't touch it, right?
Right,
So
it's the same old thing.
Stupid.
I know, and I never understand that. Like, you have to be a couple generations late before you're allowed to say.
And people go like, oh, the precautionary is so idealistic. Well,
Right.
waiting until the damage has been done is so stupid, because the chemical is then, that we've now determined is dangerous, is now in the environment. What are you doing about these electronics that are sending their bromated whatever into the air and water?
Leaching their toxic contents into the ecosystem, right?
And what do you do?
So what we do is we've identified a pathway or pathways that these electronics can move down, where they can be taken apart carefully in a way that they can't harm anybody or anything. So that means two things. One thing, it means keeping those electronics from leaving the country and ending up in a lax regulatory environment, right?
Right.
So
Where they get burned and
Right.
the kids are going through trying to save the little copper wires and getting poisoned.
like some of the pictures, burning electronics dump in Nigeria with the children in the flip-flops running through harvesting the metal, right? So keeping that from happening means keeping that stuff here in North America, where the laws at least prevent, the child labor part of that or the open burning of that. And then that means paying recyclers to take those things apart carefully. So not containerize them and export them, not burn them, not throw them in a hole in the ground, but actually take them apart to our specifications, and then be willing to share what happened to the commodities that resulted from that. In other words, you and I see a
Some
TV.
can be reused, right?
Some
Can't it?
can be, but if you have a broken TV, the most likely thing that's going to happen with that TV, if it's not easily repaired, especially if it's not a new flat screen, is that it's going to be broken down for the metal, the plastics, the glass, and the wood. And if that's done in a careful way, so that the difficult parts of that, like the 4 to 8 pounds of powdered lead in the screen of that TV, are contained properly so they don't get free in the environment and hurt people and animals and make them sick, then we're fine. And that kind of thing, I think, is the easy part of it. The less easy part of it is the reuse part. So some of the stuff still works. How do you get into the hands of people who could use it? Some of the stuff doesn't work, but it could be fixed easily. Again, how can you get that fixed into a new owner? Some of it doesn't work and it can't really be fixed, but there are parts in there that could be used. In other words, we get computer that might be partly water damaged, but let's say some of the video cards in there, a video card's still good, and some memory expansion module is still good. Well, we all know manufacturing those things isn't pretty. So if there's a way that could get to a secondary market, then that would be good. So we identify that.
How often do you do this?
In Marblehead, 6 or 7 times a year.
And you could see it in the reporter?
You can see it in the reporter. And when you hear Household Hazardous Waste Day is coming, which is usually the first Saturday in June and the first Saturday in November, not always, but usually, we'll be there doing electronics recycling.
And you can bring your cell phones, your TVs, your computers, your iPads, whatever your...
Nearly anything with a battery or a plug.
Okay. And you have to pay for it.
You have to pay for it because we have to pay our recyclers to take it apart carefully to our specifications.
But it's better to pay for that than to suffer IQ damage to your child because there's so much lead. I didn't even realize the screens had lead in them. If we could do this conscientiously as a nation, would prevent illness, correct?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it would prevent illness and it would prevent environmental destruction. I mean, if you reframe the whole thing, it's a massive human rights and environmental issue on both ends. The way we make the stuff and the way it ends its life is going to have a huge impact on human health and ecosystem health.
So no matter how despairing we are of the future of this planet, if you could arrive in heaven, you could say to God, or St. Peter, but I recycled all my toxic electronic equipment, and you will get a special place in heaven for that, correct?
Every good deed along those lines is probably legal tender when you get to the pearly gates.
Right. So it's a little bit better or as good as keep throwing out your paper to be recycled and your cans and your bottles and all that stuff. Now you can move one step further to improving the planet by bringing your electronics to this guy who is swimming through poop for you, for your sins, right? And I bet we see you again, Christopher, because you're really doing stuff that helps the rest of us, help the planet.
Well, thank you for having me again.
All of us want to do the best we can with our limited power, and you're magnifying it, so thanks.
Well, thank you. I hope to live up to that.
'Cause an idea, whose time has come, cannot be stopped by anyone. Plant your seeds in fertile ground. There ain't nothing gonna keep it down. Oh, we can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. We can do it.